Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab, today we are pleased to welcome back Tim Ritter. A native of Springfield, Missouri, Tim grew up in a performing family and discovered writing and public speaking early in life. By age 13, his writings included poetry, 2 children's adventure books, several plays, and a comic strip, which eventually found its way to his junior high school newspaper. He also discovered that he liked being on stage and how people tended to listen when he spoke into a microphone. Throughout his 29-year professional career as a mechanical engineer, Tim wrote articles for trade magazines and was featured speaker at hundreds of seminars across the country. Soul Sketchers, his second edition, was released in 2020. It's a heartfelt collection of short stories and poems, most of which are based on Tim's personal experiences. He refers to the book as a real, sometimes brutal look at life, death, marriage, divorce, and everything in between. Tim's award-winning Sarah Burning, released in 2021, tells the true story of a fatal house fire in rural Missouri in 1959 and the struggle of the 3 survivors who had to put the physical and emotional pain, survivor guilt, and horrifying memories of that night behind them. It is a story of perseverance, strength, and redemption in which everyone, including the rest of the family, had to literally rise from the ashes. Tim lives outside Fairgrove, Missouri with his wife, Lisa, writing full-time and speaking to civic groups and organizations on a variety of topics. In addition to being past president of the Springfield Writers Guild, he's a member of the Sleuth Inc. Mystery Writers, the Historical Societies in Douglas and Christian Counties, Ozarks Genealogical Society, and the Poe Studies Association. Tim can be contacted by his website at timritter.net and can be found on Facebook as author Tim Ritter, on Instagram as author Tim Ritter, and YouTube as Timothy L. Ritter. Today's presentation is titled The Story of the Liberty Bell. Have you ever delved deeply into the story of the famous bell? If not, you're in for a big surprise. The story of the bell is much larger than a crack. This presentation will tell the story from the initial request for the bell to be development, the facility in which, I'm probably messing this up, in which the relic is currently housed. So without further ado, Tim, I'm sorry for messing up that last paragraph. Welcome back.
No, that's fine. You did great. No complaints here. And good day, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope that you enjoy this. Hopefully everybody can see that. I've got the screen shared now. I do a lot of presentations throughout the year, and several of them are to retirement facilities. And when I decided I wanted to do this as kind of a patriotic presentation, I thought I was going to do a simple presentation about a bell. About this historic bell. And boy, when I got to researching everything, I discovered there's a whole lot more to this story than just a simple bell. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope it's some new information for you, and we'll just go ahead and dive right in here. The original bell was not called the Liberty Bell when it first made its appearance in the colonies. It was actually known as, let me see if I can get everything moving forward there. There we go. It was actually originally called the State House Bell. That was its name. And we'll kind of figure out why exactly it was called the State House Bell. All of this all centers around really Philadelphia. That's where 99% of what we're going to talk about took place. And of course, back in those days, Philadelphia looked like this, or the greater county area, sparsely populated, with most of the population centered around the city of Philadelphia. And of course, if you've been there lately, it looks like this. But what we're going to talk about has to do an awful lot with this facility, which most of us know, of course, as Independence Hall. But originally, it was called the Philadelphia State House. And that, of course, is one of the biggest reasons why the bell was called the State House Bell, was because it resided in the Philadelphia State House. Let's go through some specifications here real quick. The bell is made of 70% copper and 20% tin. Of course, that doesn't add up to 100% because there are always impurities and something like that. So in round figures, that's the general makeup of the bell. Its width at the widest spot down there at the bottom is 3.82 feet. Its height is 4 feet. And the circumference is kind of interesting. At the crown, the very top of the bell, It has a 7.5-foot circumference. And then down at the bottom lip, it is a 12-foot circumference. And just in case you're wondering about the weight, yes, it does come in at just over a ton, at 2,080 pounds. So that, my friends, is a big bell. Going back to its origins, a city bell was originally located in the Pennsylvania State House, which that bell had been used since the city's founding in 1682. Now, you'll have to pardon me for this particular image here because it does show the steeple where the bell was housed. Originally, there was no steeple. The bell that they originally had since 1682 was used to alert the public, to proclamations and civic danger. Of course, you have to remember there's no such thing as a siren back then. So a bell was the way to summon people to say, we either need to talk about something or I need to alert you to some particular danger. Now, since they didn't have any kind of bell tower or anything like that, the original bell hung on a tree behind the hall. And so they eventually decided they wanted to do something just a little bit more majestic than having their bell hanging on a tree behind the State House. And so this guy came along. This is William Penn, the founder of Philadelphia. He was the one who actually originally bought that first bell. And just in case his face is a little familiar to you, I can't resist but mention, yes, that is the face of the Quaker Oats guy. They use that as their inspiration. And yeah, we'll move on. In 1751, they started building a bell tower. And so they decided they wanted a better quality bell than the one that had been hanging on the tree. They wanted it to be of a better tone, and they wanted it to be heard at greater distances. And so they began to toss around this idea of purchasing a new bell for their nice tower that was going to be built. Now, this gentleman, Isaac Norris, was the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. And he gave orders to a man by the name of Robert Charles, who was the colony's agent in London. Again, remember, we're still in colony status here. And so there's a tight connection between the colonies and London, and each colony had their own agent. And Robert Charles was the Pennsylvania agent in London. And what Isaac Norris asked of him was to obtain a good bell of about 2,000 pounds. Don't know where he came up with those specifications, but somehow he knew that that was basically what he wanted. And he was very specific about what he wanted for an inscription on this bell. And the inscription was, "Proclaim liberty through all the land to all the inhabitants thereof." And that just happens to be a biblical verse from Leviticus. And so that's what he wanted to have on the bell. And the rest of it actually says, by order of the Assembly of the Province of Pennsylvania for the State House in Philadelphia. So that was the complete inscription that was requested upon the bell. Now, they contacted a gentleman by the name of Thomas Lester, who worked for the bell founding firm of Lester and Pack. Now, that firm eventually became known as the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. And they were no beginners in the manufacture of bells. They had made 4 bells for Westminster Abbey. They had made the clock bell for St. Paul's Cathedral. They made a bell for Big Ben. And officially, Lester and Pack started in the 1570s. And they were on the site of what you're seeing there since the 1740s. But the actual origins of the company overall in various forms can be traced back to a foundry that was started in 1363. So these people had 400 years of bell making experience. So they were definitely not amateurs. And actually, interestingly enough, there's a recent photograph of the manufacturing facility. They're doing some machining on a bell there now. That particular company, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, was in operation actually right up until May of 2017. So that company operated for hundreds of years, and of course just recently closed within the last decade. Now the building, the original Bell Foundry, does still stand. That of course is how it looked back in the early 1900s. This is how it looks now. It's now a hotel, but you see in that small corner where it says Church Bell Foundry, there's still a little tiny museum in that little pocket, but otherwise the rest of the building, fortunately, was not demolished, but it was turned into a hotel. So I guess if you go to London, you can still stay in the building where the Liberty Bell was originally manufactured. Now, the original bell cost £150, which in today's money is about $50,000. It arrived in Philadelphia in August of 1752. Now, Norris wrote that the bell was in good order, but they had not sounded it yet because they were still building the clock tower. And so they put the bell on a stand to test its sound. And when they first rang it, when the clapper first struck the side of the bell, the rim cracked. And they tried to return the bell to London by the same ship that had brought it, but the ship refused to take it for whatever reason. So there were some local founders by the name of John Pass and John Stowe who offered to recast the bell. Pass had been an immigrant recently from Malta and had experience in the manufacture of metal objects back then. He had had his own foundry in Malta. And Stowe was just 4 years out of apprenticeship to work in a foundry. And neither of them had any experience with bells. But Stowe had a foundry on 2nd Street in Philadelphia, and so they were given the task of recasting this bell since it had cracked. And so they cut up the bell into small pieces and melted it down. And then while they had it in a melted state, they decided that originally it had been too brittle, and that was why it cracked. So they added more copper to change the composition by about 10%. And the new bell, was ready by March of 1753. And you can see there's the engraving that had been originally requested, and then they added their own name to the bell, Pass and Stowe, and you can still see that on the casting of the bell to this day. That's why it says Pass and Stowe, because that's the name of the two guys that had recast it. Now, a public celebration was scheduled to celebrate the fact that they had their new bell freshly recast and hopefully wasn't going to crack again. Now, with this big public celebration, they brought out a bunch of free food and free drink. So the population was not only happy to be there with full bellies, but they were also having quite a good time thanks to the free drink. Now, when the bell was struck, this new bell was struck, it did not break. But unfortunately, the sound that it put out was not very appealing. One person recorded that it sounded like two coal scuttles banged together. And because of their jovial atmosphere, the crowd began to laugh at how bad the bell had sounded. And so Pass and Stowe, they're just a wee bit embarrassed by this whole thing. And so they quickly took the bell, broke it up again, and recast it yet again. So we're on our third bell from this same original mass of material. It was completed in June. And this time when they rang it, it was deemed acceptable, but Isaac Norris said he still didn't like it. But nonetheless, it was hung in the steeple of the Great House that month. Now, the reasons for the issues with the bell were never confirmed at that time. The Whitechapel Foundry, of course, was not going to take any responsibility whatsoever. They said it was either damaged in transit or broken because the bell ringer was inexperienced and had hit it on the rim instead of the main body, you know, that type of thing. But in 1975, there was an organization called the Winterthur Museum, and they conducted an analysis on the metal of the bell. Now, the Winterthur Museum is a museum of American decorative arts, and it's got objects that date back into the mid-1600s, and it was founded by a member of the DuPont family. They're basically considered to be a study for a center for the study of American art and culture, and so you know this is kind of up their alley. So when they did a bunch of tests on some material that had been brought as a sample from the bell, they concluded that essentially a series of errors had been made in the construction, the reconstruction, meaning the recasting, and then the second recasting of the bell, resulting in a brittle bell that barely missed being broken up for scrap. Those were their words. They found that a higher level of tin existed in the Liberty Bell, higher than what was typical for the Whitechapel bells of that era. And that suggested that there was perhaps an error in the alloys, the original alloys from the Whitechapel organization, and perhaps they used some scrap rather than pure copper. Also, they decided that on the second recasting, Pass and Stowe must have used pewter instead of other materials because it was less expensive, but it has a higher lead content. They were detecting lead in the bell, and the fact that there's the potential that they may not have thoroughly mixed the metals. So, you know, basically it sounds like there was a combination of a multitude of errors that created this brittle bell that essentially didn't stand a chance from the day it was originally cast. But the recastings most certainly did not help it one bit. Now back to Isaac Norris, who, you know, he originally was the guy that ordered the bell. He was still very unhappy. He ordered another bell from the Whitechapel Foundry, hoping that they would take this new bell, or the older bell, excuse me, and take it on credit. In 1754, the Assembly actually decided to keep both bells. They weren't going to send the original one back. They decided that the new one would go to the tower and that the old one would be set aside for whatever use the House would decide afterwards. And it ended up being used actually to summon the Assembly. So both bells were actually going to be put to use for a time. Now back to the original bell. It was rung in 1760 to mark the accession of George III to the throne. Throughout that decade, the Assembly allowed a local church to use the State House for their church services, and they allowed them to ring the bell as well. And it was also, of course, back to that original comment that I had made about the purpose of the bell. It was rung to summon people to public meetings. You know, again, it's basically the alarm, the notice to a meeting, all that kind of stuff. Now, funny enough, in 1772, there was a group of citizens that rose up, and they complained that the bell was being rung too often. But anyway, nonetheless, it continued to be used. Now, you know, as a genealogist that you have to look at family stories and try to figure out if they're true or not. Well, the same, of course, as you know, is true with just about any story from history. And one of those stories from history that comes out to not be true, even though it's quite the legend, the Liberty Bell was not rung on July 4th, believe it or not. See, the public announcement of the Declaration of Independence was actually made 4 days later on the 8th. It was not made on the 4th, even though that's when they signed it. The public announcement came on the 8th. Now, of course, on the 8th, many bells were rung that day, but for some reason, it is not recorded whether or not that bell that we now know as the Liberty Bell, we don't know if it was actually rung or not because nobody recorded that fact. There is some question as to whether or not the steeple was strong enough yet to allow the bell to ring based on some of the evidence as the construction of that steeple had continued. So we really don't know for sure despite the story. Now, after Washington's defeat at the Battle of Brandywine, Philadelphia was in a lot of trouble. They had no defenses, and so the entire city was in danger, and people decided that perhaps they need to look after this expensive new bell. And so it was removed and taken to the Zion Reformed Church in the town of Northampton, which we now know as Allentown. Hidden under the floorboards during the British occupation of Philadelphia, the bell was hidden for 9 months until the British retreat. Now, when it was returned to Philadelphia, this steeple that had been built just for the bell was in terrible condition because of everything that had been going on, and it had to be torn down and rebuilt. So we still do not have a bell that's in a bell tower doing its job. It was put in storage until 1785. So the road is long and twisted, just trying to get to where we've got a bell up in a steeple. Now, remounted for ringing, since there was some concern about the steeple, it was placed actually on an upper floor of the State House. In the early years, it was rung on the 4th of July. It was rung on Washington's birthday and also Election Day. They also used it to call students at the University of Pennsylvania to their classes. They rang it to summon the session of legislators. But then in 1799, the state capital was moved to Lancaster. And so the state proposed to tear down the state hall and to sell the land for building plots. But the city of Philadelphia stepped in and they bought the building and they bought the land and they bought the bell for $70,000, which is nearly $2 million today. In 1828, the second bell that they had purchased was actually sold to St. Augustine's Roman Catholic Church. Now, that church was burned down by an anti-Catholic mob in the riots that occurred there in Philadelphia in 1844. But in the rubble of that church, they did find the remains of the bell, and they had it recast. And that bell is actually now located at Villanova University. So that is, at Villanova, their bell is actually that second bell that was bought all those years ago. Now, despite all the legends, it is not precisely known how the bell cracked. It happened sometime between 1817 and 1846. The bell was mentioned in many newspaper articles throughout that time frame, but they had made no mention of the crack until 1846. The February 1846 issue of the Public Ledger reported that the bell was rung on February 23rd, 1846 for Washington's birthday. But they stated that it had long been cracked, but it had been put in order by having the sides of the crack filled. And you know how that kind of thing went based on the cracks that still exist in that bell. It was reported that around noon it was discovered that the ringing had caused the crack to extend greatly. And they said in the article, quote, "The old Independence bell now hangs irreparably cracked." Now let's look at some of the legends about how it was cracked, because there were all kinds of different stories that came out with ideas about how exactly it had cracked. One legend had it that in 1824, when it was rung for a visit from the Marquis de Lafayette, that it cracked at that time. There was another one that said it happened in 1829 when it was rung to announce the British Roman Catholic Relief Act. And then there was another legend that said in 1835 it was cracked when it rung upon the death of Chief Justice John Marshall. And then the one that's even more obscure and kind of iffy is somewhere between 1841 and 1845. It either happened on July 4th or Washington's birthday. So it's kind of like family legends. There's going to be a whole bunch of different versions, but unfortunately, at this point in the game, nobody really has any idea when exactly it cracked and how. Now, it was first called the Liberty Bell in an 1835 article in New York's Anti-Slavery Society's Journal. In that article, they had been talking about the fact that Philadelphia had this bell that was cast with a biblical statement about liberty, but they basically said Philadelphia had not done enough to promote the abolitionist cause. So they were kind of calling them out on it. And then more articles appeared in 1837 and 1839 that talked about this Liberty Bell, but that it did not truly proclaim liberty for all inhabitants of the land. So there was quite the stir that was developing at that point, basically saying you've got this word on your bell, now put your money where your mouth is. Now in 1847, the idea of this bell being a relic of American independence came from this guy on the left. This is a writer by the name of George Lepard. He wrote a story called 4th of July, 1776 that appeared in a paper called the Saturday Courier. The story was about an old man. You can see the illustration there to the right. It was an old man that was tending the bell, that night, afraid that Congress would not have the courage to declare independence. And he's thinking about it, getting sadder and sadder, and he keeps hoping that somebody's going to tell him to ring the bell. But he knows if they don't tell him to ring the bell, he'll know that they didn't have the courage to declare independence. And then this young boy shows up, comes running up the ladder, telling him to ring the bell. And so he knew that they had finally declared independence. Now, this story was reprinted and circulated and even included in a book that Lepard put together later that was a collection of all of his stories. And of course, it basically links the bell to American independence. Well, this story, which was fictional, was reprinted in 1850 as historical fact, and it was even included in the school books at that time. So that's really where it grabbed hold, that this thing was directly related to American independence. Now, in 1848, the bell was relocated to the Assembly Room, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. That's what we see here. It was put on an ornate pedestal in that room. Now, in 1853, President Franklin Pierce visited Philadelphia and the bell, and he spoke of it as a symbol of the Revolution and American liberty. Now, this statement really irritated a lot of the African-American newspapers that existed at that time, who basically pointed out that this symbol of liberty is housed in a place where the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced. At that time, that's what that room was being used for. And so, obviously there are some people talking out of both sides of their mouth here. They're saying all this stuff about liberty, but this is the same room where they're basically, sending slaves back to their masters. No, that's not liberty. And then in 1861, Abraham Lincoln delivered an address en route to his inauguration in this room. And then after he was assassinated, his body was put on display in the room. They did that long train that went through all of the different cities. And because this was the home of independence, shall we say, Lincoln was placed in state actually within this room. And conveniently, the bell was placed near his head so that the mourners could read the inscription, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. Now, in 1876, there were some discussions held to decide how the bell could be used as part of the centennial celebration. The United States is 100 years old. Let's do something with this bell. So some people suggested that they should repair it so that it should be rung again. But fortunately, that was rejected because they weren't really sure how well that it would hold up under the repair process. So ultimately, it was decided that the crack was just simply part of the bell's character. And instead of ringing it for the centennial, a cast replica was made that weighed 13,000 pounds. This used metal from 4 melted down cannons, one from each side of the Revolution and one from each side in the Civil War. 13,000-pound replica. Now, the replica was sounded on the Centennial Exposition grounds on July 4th in 1876. But guess what? Nobody liked the sound. So they had to take that behemoth and they recast it to try to improve its sound. So I don't know. Somebody was really having a lot of trouble making bells that sounded worth a hoot. But anyway, they did recast it, and now that is the steeple clock bell at Independence Hall. Originally, after it was recast, it was hung from the ceiling of a room in Independence Hall using a chain with 13 links to signify the 13 original colonies. Now, between 1885 and 1915, the original Liberty Bell went on several tours. Now, in 1893, when it returned from Chicago, it was noticed that the bell had a new crack that was developing in it. And they also discovered that the private watchman that they had in charge of security for the bell was actually cutting off small pieces of it to sell as souvenirs. Believe it or not. It was then put in a glass and oak case so that would not happen again. And then in 1898, it was placed in the tower room of Independence Hall, where it remained until 1975 under 24-hour guard, and it rarely traveled any other time after that. Now, during World War II, it was suggested that the bell be moved to Fort Knox for safekeeping, just simply because, we didn't know if there would actually be attacks. They knew that there were German submarines just off the coast, and of course, they were afraid of Japanese attacks, although those would have happened on the other coast, but still, it was a great concern as to the safety of the bell. But the idea of removing it and putting it in Fort Knox was heavily protested. And so basically the bell remained in Philadelphia behind glass. Now on December 17th, 1944, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry offered to recast the bell at no cost as a token of friendship. And they couldn't help but add just a little joke in the midst of their offer to recast the bell. They said that doing it at no cost depended on they had to send the bell back using the original shipping container that it had arrived some nearly 200 years before. Fortunately, the humor of that was appreciated, and war between America and England did not break out yet again. Now, in 1948, the city of Philadelphia agreed to transfer custody of Independence Hall and the bell to the federal government so that all of that could be administered by the National Park Service. Now, several ideas pertaining to how to display the bell were argued and debated. As you can imagine, everybody had all kinds of different ideas about how this should be housed and displayed. But ultimately, a glass pavilion across the street from Independence Hall was the agreed location, and that pavilion was completed in 1976, and on one of my very few trips to Philadelphia, I did manage to see that as well myself. I was there after hours, so I was only able to look through the windows to see it. Now, in 1976, Queen Elizabeth II presented a replica of the bell to the United States, once again produced by the Whitehall Bell Foundry. Now, that bell is now located in the tower of the visitor center, the former visitor center for the Independence Hall complex. That's located on South 3rd Street in Philadelphia. So you can still see that bell, that replica bell that was presented by Queen Elizabeth on the bicentennial of the United States. Now, in 1995, the National Park Service began to entertain ideas for a new design to what they wanted to call Independence Mall. This would hold not only the hall, but a new building for the bell and all that type of thing. And in 1999, after several other ideas had not succeeded, there was an architect by the name of Bernard Sawinski that developed an idea for a large pavilion with extra exhibit space. Because rather than just show off the bell, they wanted to give interpretive information about all kinds of things. The history of the Revolution, the history of the Civil War, some of the early history of the United States. Now, interestingly enough, this proposed building was going to occupy about 15% of the space that had once held George Washington's President's House, which was a pre-runner, of course, to the White House. And that's where not only Washington, but also John Adams had lived and worked. Now, during construction of the new pavilion, remnants of that old executive mansion were discovered and then promptly reburied. But protests developed because of the fact that people knew that slave quarters had been located nearby. And so they wanted to make sure that while they're, covering up and reburying the remnants of the old executive mansion, that they didn't ignore the fact that there were several enslaved people that had lived and worked and died in that area, and they should most certainly not be forgotten. And so when this new pavilion was built, there was an outline that was put in the pavement to show where the slave quarters had been, and then they made sure to add interpretive signs that were put up to describe everything that was found during construction and its historical significance, so that nothing would be swept under the rug and everything would be brought out so that everybody could look at it and discuss it and understand what had exactly happened on those grounds. Now, in its new home, the bell was located at the end of the tour of the facility, and at that time, people could actually touch it. Unfortunately, in 2001, there was a visitor that showed up that decided to attack the bell with a hammer. So, as you can see in this photograph, it is now located safely out of reach. There was a guard there at all times, and visitors have to pass through security screening to make sure that they don't have any weapons on them. Certainly nothing that could harm the bell. And it's a shame, but as we know in today's society, you have to do some things to protect the things that you love. Now, today, the bell hangs on what is believed to be its original yoke. There is no information to indicate that that yoke that you see in that photograph is anything but the original. And you can tell by looking at that wood, it is extremely old wood, that's for sure. It does weigh 2,080 pounds, having lost 10% of its weight when the pieces were shaved off of it. That thing that I mentioned to you about the guard that was keeping watch over it that was actually carving some pieces off of it. In addition to the large crack that is on its side, there is also a hairline crack that has been discovered that is running along the top of it. It runs through some of the wording that you see up toward the top of the bell. Now, a lady by the name of Constance Grieve, she is a professor and wrote a book about the history of the Independence National Historic Park. She made an excellent quote about the bell. Listen to this. She said, "Like our democracy, it is fragile and imperfect, but it has weathered threats and it has endured." And I think that sums it up very, very nicely. And that, my friends, is the story of the Liberty Bell. And I will stop sharing at that point.
Thank you, Tim. I'll open the up to the class for any questions you have for Tim. Please unmute your microphone. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I have a few. Do we know where the wood from the yoke came from?
No, we don't. No, we don't. I did not find any record whatsoever of where that came from, and I think that's why it's believed to be original, but nobody can really prove it, just simply because there just seems to be no information. That's one of those little details that seems to be lost to time. Kind of like that comment that I made, that they don't really know for sure that it was rung on July 8th, just simply because nobody wrote it down. Well, apparently nobody wrote down or recorded where that yoke came from and when. So oddly enough, that's one of those little details that we just don't know.
You know, we're in this class, we're really into DNA. I'm just wondering if somebody could ever like take a sample of the wood, if they could actually trace where the wood came from.
That would be nice. You know, you talk about carbon dating and things like that. You'd find out how old the wood was, but that would also include, you know, when it was a tree. So I don't know that that would necessarily help us any, but you know, you look at, you know, you can see it. You could see it on some of those photographs. The metal pieces that held it all together, the bolts and all of that. It all did look incredibly old. So you know, it would stand to reason that perhaps it is most certainly the original.
I noticed in the chat box, several people have actually gone to visit the Liberty Bell in person over the course of their lifetime.
Yeah, I see that. That's excellent.
Let's see here. Randall put in, since there's an interest to our veterans, there's one other issue that's, okay, hold on. Oh, I think he's talking about something else that we talked about before the beginning of your presentation. I have another couple questions. The person who was awful to have tried to harm the bell, did they actually do any damage, or were they caught before the damage happened?
Well, from my understanding, they were apprehended very quickly. As you can imagine, all of a sudden the bell is being rung. I know that they were able to strike it at least once, you know, but I don't know how many raps they actually got in on it, but they were, as you can imagine, politely tackled and apprehended. And I really don't know what charges they would have been brought up on at that time, but nonetheless, they were stopped before any real damage could be done to the bell.
Oh, that's wonderful that it didn't get damaged.
Yeah.
I guess this is probably a question you probably get a lot. Do you happen to know when was the last time the bell was rung?
Let's see. It seems like I had that in there. Hang on just a second. Let me scroll back real quick. Well, it was most certainly in that article in 1846 that they said, let's see here. Yeah. So they were ringing the bell on February 23rd, 1846, for Washington's birthday, and that they had filled the crack and they were ringing it, but it was extending the crack yet again. And so that was when they stated that it now hangs irreparably cracked. So it looks like that February 23rd, 1846 was the last time that it was actually rung. And Marcia, you're exactly right. We have no idea what that bell sounds like, and never will.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
makes you
it's a
wonder.
shame, isn't it?
I mean, can you imagine if they would just ring it once and then record it? Everyone could always hear it. Yeah, that's really, Marcia, that's a great question. That is
Yeah,
a
it
great
really is. It really is. There, there's also reinforcement that they put inside the bell. I think they refer to it as a spider because it's got a lot of these arms. You can kind of see it in the photographs of it sticking out of the bottom. All these little arms that are against the sides of it to kind of support it and hold it together at the same time. Because the stresses, especially with that crack, it's trying to pull apart. And so these little arms that are inside are holding it together. And my guess is that that, of course, deadens any sound that we would hear, because there's so much inside there that's just trying to keep it together. So, yeah, even if we could hear it today, I don't think it would sound like much.
You mentioned that when the bell cracked, the manufacturer had blamed the person who didn't ring it correctly. I did not realize that there was an incorrect way to ring a bell.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, I
Yeah,
wonder, is this something you have to be trained for, like to be a bell ringer?
well, it sure sounds like it, apparently. I bet the apprenticeship program's really short. But I mean, there you go. That even back in those days, you've got a manufacturer that's going, well, it can't be our fault. It's got to be your fault. It's not our fault.
I noticed in the picture there are two, like one at the top of the crack, one at the bottom of the crack. They look kind of like bolts.
Yep.
Is that
Yeah.
their attempt at trying to keep the bell together?
Yes. Yeah. That was a very early attempt to try to hold the bell together. And of course it doesn't fill in the gap or anything like that, but obviously under the tremendous strain of all of that weight, it just doesn't do the trick, unfortunately. But there again, that is another one of those things that's part of the character, is those two little knobby bolts that are trying to do their job holding it together.
When you went over the weight and the size, the circumference, all that, I couldn't help but wonder, not being anywhere close to being an engineer, how would you get a bell that heavy up into the steeple? I mean, was it like, obviously they couldn't take it through the building, so they probably had to bring it up on the outside of the building, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, yeah, you'd have some kind of a like an early version of a crane with a block and tackle and several guys hoisting, and then once you get it up to the right height, you would have to have some way to pull it in, and it was all just purely manual labor.
Wow, that would have been
Yeah.
interesting. I remember as a child, growing up, like I used to sit with my brother watching construction sites, just as houses were being built. We'd just sit across the street and watch the builders build it. Can you imagine what it would be like to witness the, raising of the bell and putting it into the steeple? That must have been quite
Oh
a
yeah.
experience for the
Oh
people
yeah, I'm
there.
sure it attracted a crowd. They'd do anything for entertainment around there. Uh, Now, Karen did make a notice that the Penn State students digitally recreated it in 1999, E flat.
Oh, thank you, Karen.
Yeah, yeah. Now, DLB has raised their hand.
Yeah, well,
Oh, go ahead, Tina.
I was noticing from what you said, that the the bill was commissioned prior to the Revolutionary War. How
Hmm.
did England feel about that? I mean, it's proclaiming liberty.
Yeah, well, that's a real good question. And maybe that's why the greatest alloys were not necessarily used. I don't know. They're going to make a bell for those ungrateful colonists, and it's hard to say. Money talks, of course, and maybe it was all business. I don't know, but it does kind of make you wonder. And perhaps they weren't, really taking it seriously at that point. Those silly colonists. Yeah, we know they're grumbling, but they'll never leave the crown. So let's go ahead and make this bell. This is fine. We'll get some money out of them. And then maybe they just thought it solidified the relationship. I don't know. I really don't know. But my guess is it was all in the name of business.
Tim, out of curiosity, you said that the company who made the bell had made bells for other parts, I think you said, of Britain. Did those bells crack as well?
No, those bells are still in use. Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Big Ben. All of the bells that they had made prior to that are still in use.
Wow.
Yeah.
This one just had the unfortunate makeup.
That's right. Yeah. And it just so happened to go overseas to those ungrateful colonists.
You mentioned Isaac Norris. Do you know anything about his life? I mean, how did he become part of it? I mean, what was his story?
Well, the fact that he was, hang on, let me go back to him real quick for just a second, because I have some notes there about it. He was the speaker of the provincial assembly. So he was a politician. And he was Isaac Norris II. His father was an early settler as well. Don't really know that much about him, but there's information all over if you Google it. But he was just one of those politicians, and for whatever reason, I guess because as Speaker of the Assembly, he had the authority to give the orders to the London agent Robert Charles to request the bell, so he most certainly was in the position of power to do it, and so that's what put him in the limelight. But as far as the rest of his story, off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I really don't know that much more about him.
Many of the people in my class can trace their families all the way back to the beginning of America, all through the colonial period.
Right.
I'm just wondering if anybody in my class, just wondering, I'm not expecting an answer, but I'm just wondering if anybody might be related to Isaac Norris, either directly or indirectly. That would be interesting for the class to look into.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There's got to be a good story there, a good family story behind that.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
I bet you there's probably books published on his family.
Probably some local historical society over there in Pennsylvania has probably got a whole bunch on him.
Mm-hmm. Probably, maybe even on Family Search. For those in the class who might be interested in the life of Isaac Norris and his family history, maybe in the second half of class today, we can go on to Family Search and go into their online ebook library and maybe see who his family married into, because who knows, maybe somebody here in my class might be related to him.
Yeah, and be aware that there are two of them, Isaac Norris and Isaac Norris II, and this guy is Isaac Norris II.
Okay, excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll give the class one more chance to, I see there's a lot of nice comments in the chat box here about how they enjoyed learning about the Liberty Bell. So if there's anybody who has a question for Tim, please unmute your microphone. We'll give it a few more seconds. I myself have not gone to Philadelphia. It's on my bucket list. So one of these days I do plan on getting there.
Yeah, it's an amazing place.
Okay, well, Tim, it looks like all the questions have been answered. So I cannot thank you enough for giving us more information about the Liberty Bell that I'm sure any of us knew. And with that, did you want to talk? Did you got a few seconds, or are you in a hurry?
No, I've got time.
Okay, can you kind of, for the people who are new to my class, can you kind of give them a real short synopsis of Sarah Burning that you gave to my class several years back?
Yeah, absolutely. And there it is, right there. So here's the idea. In October of 1959, the farmhouse that my father grew up in caught fire. He was not there at the time, but 6 family members were his parents, my grandparents, Orville and Sarah Ritter, and then their youngest son, Neil, and then another son, Dewey, who had just been released from the Air Force, and he had with him his wife and their 18-month-old son. When the fire was discovered, they were all sleeping upstairs. There were 2 bedrooms in this little tiny farmhouse. And when they discovered the fire, the staircase was already fully engulfed in flames, so they had to jump out the windows. Well, only 4 of them made it out, not including Dewey and his 18-month-old son. But just before the floor caved in underneath them, he shoved his wife out the window. And then on the other side, my Neil, the youngest son, and my grandmother, Sarah, and then Orville, my grandfather, they jumped, Neil catching his 2 parents. But Orville lingered in the room too long. He didn't want to jump in just his underwear, so he had to put his pants on. And ended up, his lungs were just destroyed from all the smoke inhalation, and he died 3 days later. So this was a story that I had heard since I was a kid. And in college, I was talking with my mother, and I said, I really would like to someday write about the fire, and I'd like to talk to Uncle Neil since he was there. And she said, don't you dare. She said, don't you ever talk to that man about anything that happened that night. And so the whole thing was put on the back burner, but it just kind of stayed in my head. And so several years ago, I thought, I'm going to do this. And so I started interviewing just a handful, actually just one relative that is still alive that was actually in the house at any time. And then one relative by marriage that was aware of some of the things that had gone on. And the rest of it was all about just research and trying to wade through all the things that I had been told versus reality. And I spent about 5 years writing the book. And, if you're just going to write a book about a fatal fire, then, it's sad, but you really don't learn anything from it. But I realized that not only dissecting the fire itself, but also the lives of those 3 people that survived it, as they tried to put their life back together, especially Sarah. She lost her house, she lost her husband, all of her belongings, and she lost her son and grandson. So it was just an awful thing, but it's the story of those 3 survivors and how they put their lives back together again. So after about 5 years worth of work, Sarah burning became a reality. And actually right now I am trying to put the finishing touches on another book called Sarah and Orville. And it is essentially a companion to Sarah burning, kind of a prequel, but kind of not. But this is actually going to dive into the ancestry of Orville and Sarah so that you can kind of understand them a little bit more and the people that they came from. And again, you want to talk about an exercise in a deep dive in family legends and family stories and trying to get to the bottom of them to figure out what's true and what's a bunch of baloney. That's what this project has been. So hopefully within the next couple of months or so, I will have Sarah and Orville available as well.
At the beginning of class today, I mentioned that on April 27th, it's National Tell a Story Day. And that's really what this whole class is all about, is exactly what you just mentioned. The whole Sarah burning is the perfect example of what I encourage, every one of us to do on a weekly basis, is write your family story, not just the birth, death, and marriage dates, but the story behind those dates, what happened in the course of their life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, names and dates are all well and good, but if you don't know anything about those people, then it's just names and dates, but if you know the stories, it makes them come to life. And interestingly enough, researching this latest book, when I started writing these old family stories down is when I finally started realizing that there were some holes in the stories. And it hadn't occurred to me. I had heard these stories over and over again, but then when I started writing it down, I thought, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. this doesn't make any sense. And so I started really diving into it and, discovered a whole bunch of stuff that, some things I could clarify that, yes, this story is true. And some I looked at it and just went, no, there's just no way this couldn't have happened.
My family has a similar story. My mom and her brother have the same mother, but they had different fathers because my grandmother was married twice. And in her second husband, who is my half uncle's parents, they lived in North Dakota, and they had a what's the word, a propane tank. This is back in like the 1940s.
Wow.
And the wife and the sister went downstairs, and they were trying to light, if I remember the story correctly, they're trying to light something to do. I mean, I don't know whether it was a heater. They were trying to light something, and there was a leak, and the house exploded.
Ugh.
And the story that I had been told is that they were killed, instantly with the explosion. However, in the course of doing family history research, they actually lived a few days. I found the newspaper articles that covered it. So, it's the story, like you said, it's so important to get it from firsthand sources.
Yeah.
Like you said, even though sometimes it might bring up very bad memories for people, to discuss something that was very painful from the past. But it's so important because that's, the original source, people who witnessed it, rather than getting it, handed down for 2 or 3 generations, and then the story loses its truth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly, and really, you almost have to double check even what the people you're interviewing tell you as well. Because I listen to a lot of talk about World War II and the veterans that tell their stories and all that, and there's a really big discussion going on about memory and how sometimes a person will tell you a story about something that they remember, and in their mind it really did truly happen that way. But what you discover is that if they have talked with other people about their impression of what happened, sometimes that impression from another person gets imprinted on that person's memory. And it's not that they're lying or anything like that. They really believe that that's what they saw and heard, but sometimes it's an imprinted memory. And so they have found with an awful lot of veterans that they've talked to from World War II that in some cases, guys that were not at a particular place have a memory of it, but it's because they heard it from somebody that was there. So it's kind of an interesting thing that psychologists and all have been and historians have been looking into to try to understand this idea of what really is a true memory and what's an imprinted memory.
It's funny, just the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine that I grew up with. We on Facebook, we went to the same schools together as we were growing up. And we, I grew up in a very small valley in Southern California, so everybody kind of knew each other. And we were talking about how after, I think it was the first year after we got out of high school, we had gone to see Mae West. She was elderly at the time, but she was doing like a little tour. I think she'd done a movie in the 1970s, if I remember. But anyhow, we'd gone to see Mae West. And I remembered that it was at Cal State Lutheran in Southern California. And she was talking about it on Facebook. I said, "Oh yeah, I remember when we went to Cal State Lutheran." She goes, "Oh no, it was at Moore Park College." And I said, "No, it was at Cal State." And we both went there together. We drove in the same car. We went there, but she remembered it as one college, and I remembered it as a different college. So I ended up settling it, and I went on to newspapers.com, and I found the article, and I gave it to her, and I was right, she was wrong. But the point being is it's only been 50 years, and I guess that it is more time than I'd like to admit. But it's funny, we both sat next to each other watching her. We drove together, we bought the tickets together, but she swore it was in one place and I swore it was in another.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how that works. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Okay, well, I'll give the class one more opportunity. Any questions for our guest speaker? Okay, well, I guess that's everything. So Tim, thank you once again for allowing us to record and for giving us your generous time today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Suzanne. Thanks again for asking. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and nice to see all of you. And hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime.
Thank you. You have a wonderful weekend.
All right, you too, Suzanne. Thanks, everybody.
I'll stop the recording.